Imagine dying alone in a sparsely furnished hotel room at the age of 86. You are totally penniless. Your only meaningful companions, quite literally, are the bruised and battered city pigeons that you have spent your final years nursing back to health, sitting by the windowsills of a New York hotel. But then, within mere hours of your final breath, before your body has even fully cooled, government agents are swarming your room. They are not there to pay respects. They are systematically tearing through your belongings, breaking into your safe, and seizing your entire life's work. Private journals and physical models are taken and locked away under an impenetrable guise of national security. What exactly are they frantically searching for? They are looking for the blueprints to a weapon capable of wiping out 10,000 airplanes from 250 miles away. This is not the opening sequence of some dystopian spy thriller. This is the very real, heavily documented aftermath of the death of a man who literally illuminated the modern world. The sheer, palpable panic from the United States government contrasts so sharply with the tragic, quiet isolation of his final days, perfectly encapsulating the dual nature of his legacy. On one hand, you have a frail old man feeding birds. On the other, you have a mind so profoundly powerful that the military establishment genuinely believed he might have casually invented a weapon that could alter the course of a global war. To uncover the truth, one must look at an absolute mountain of sources, from declassified FBI files that read like pure Cold War paranoia, to deeply technical engineering analyses that actually break down the physics of his patents. There are historical journals from the Gilded Age, alongside incredibly personal, modern accounts exploring the brutal realities of severe mental health issues. Over the last few decades, the myth of this man has completely eclipsed his humanity. We desperately need to separate the man from the myth, not just by understanding the fascinating mechanics of the physical machines he invented, but by deconstructing how his mind actually operated. We must examine why his foundational ideas were so inherently dangerous to the financial and industrial status quo of his era, and figure out why, decades after he died in 1943, there are still people frantically hunting for his missing papers. We are going to bypass the heavy, impenetrable engineering jargon to give you the ultimate shortcut to understanding one of history's most fascinating, misunderstood, and controversial geniuses. If you are captivated by the untold depths of history's greatest minds, please take a moment to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Let us start at the very beginning, because even his birth feels like something meticulously crafted by a screenwriter. He was born at the exact stroke of midnight between July 9th and July 10th, 1856, during a violently intense, sky-shattering lightning storm. This took place in the village of Smiljan, which is in modern-day Croatia, but back then was a rugged part of the Austrian Empire's military frontier. The local legend passed down through the family dictates that the midwife delivering him was absolutely terrified by the lightning strikes hitting the mountains all around the house. She called the storm a terrible omen and basically declared that the baby would be a child of the storm, a child of darkness. His mother, Juka, supposedly snapped back at her mid-labor and said, "No, of light." If we truly want to understand the architecture of his brain, we must look incredibly closely at those two parents, because they shaped the entire psychological foundation of everything that came next. His father, Milutin, was a strict, unyielding Serbian Orthodox priest. He forced young Nikola to perform rigorous, almost punishing mental gymnastics daily. His father would demand he memorize incredibly long, complex passages of text in multiple languages, force him to calculate massive mathematical equations entirely in his head, or even try to guess the inner thoughts of other people, as an exercise in extreme empathy and observation. It was this localized pressure that built the raw cognitive horsepower for his later abilities. His mother, Juka, presented a dynamic that gets even more fascinating. Despite being completely illiterate, she never learned to read or write. She possessed a flawless photographic memory. Not only could she recite thousands of lines of epic Serbian poetry from memory, but she was an incredibly gifted, practical, mechanical inventor. She managed a rural farm and actually invented intricate household tools from scratch, including mechanical egg beaters, complex weaving instruments, and labor-saving devices she simply visualized and built out of wood and metal just to make her daily life more efficient. Tesla himself later stated on the record that he credited his entire inventive genius not to his formal university education, but directly to his mother's genetic influence and her innate mechanical intuition. Pop culture loves to focus on that lightning storm birth, as if it is a comic book origin story. But the real origin story is much darker and grounded in profound human suffering. When Nikola was just 5 years old, his older brother Dane, who was 12, and universally considered by everyone to be an absolute once-in-a-generation prodigy, died in a horrific horseback riding accident right in front of the house. That event is absolutely the psychological pivot point of his entire existence. When studying human development and early childhood trauma, an event like that acts as a massive, unavoidable catalyst. You have a young boy who is thrust into the suffocating, crushing weight of an impossible expectation. He was no longer just trying to be a good son. He was trying to outshine a ghost. He had to compensate for a perfect, deceased prodigy sibling whose potential would now forever be romanticized by his parents. Dane's death created a monumental shadow, and Nikola spent the next 80 years trying to outrun it. That immense, unbearable psychological burden is almost certainly the genesis of his obsessive work habits, the refusal to sleep, and the rigid, punishing self-discipline that defined his whole professional life. He could not just be good at building things. He had to be utterly flawless just to justify his own survival to his parents. This desperate need for absolute flawlessness manifested directly in how he created technology later on through his famous mental visualizations. It was not a party trick. It was a survival mechanism. He did not use blueprints. He did not sit at a drafting table sketching things out on paper, erasing mistakes, or tinkering with physical models in a workshop. He built, ran, and tested entire, highly complex industrial machines entirely within the theater of his own imagination. He possessed a level of spatial and mechanical awareness that is almost impossible for a normal person to comprehend. He could visualize a massive electrical dynamo, assemble every individual gear, coil, and bearing in his mind, turn it on, and then let it run continuously in his head for weeks while he went about his daily life. A month later, he would mentally inspect that imaginary machine to see exactly where the physical friction was wearing down the metal bearings, successfully calculating thermodynamics and physical degradation without ever picking up a single physical tool or touching a piece of copper wire. It was an extreme, highly developed form of mental processing, likely born out of the rigorous memory exercises his father had forced upon him. However, this incredible, unyielding ability to visualize complex machinery in a state of absolute perfection is exactly what set him up for the greatest conflict of his life. When you can see perfection in your mind, the flawed, messy reality of the physical world becomes incredibly frustrating. This mindset violently collided with the establishment during his college years. Tesla went to study at the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz, acting as a star student absorbing physics and mathematics at a terrifying rate. While sitting in a lecture hall, he observed a demonstration that deeply bothered his sense of mechanical elegance. The professor was demonstrating a Graham dynamo, a machine that generates direct current, or DC. To get that direct current to flow in one continuous direction, the machine relied on physical components called commutator brushes, which physically scraped against the rotating part of the motor to reverse the direction of the current. Because it was a primitive DC system, these metal brushes were sparking wildly, hissing and spitting fire. From an engineering standpoint, it was incredibly inefficient, as all that sparking was simply electrical energy being wasted as heat and light, alongside the severe physical wear and tear on the machine itself. Tesla, intuitively visualizing frictionless perfection, saw the solution immediately. He raised his hand and suggested to his highly respected professor that they could completely eliminate the sparking, the brushes, and the friction simply by using alternating current, AC, to power the motor. The professor did not just disagree. He completely humiliated Tesla in front of the entire lecture hall. The professor essentially compared Tesla's idea to building a perpetual motion machine, calling it physically impossible, a violation of the laws of physics, and openly mocking the young student's arrogance. For a young man whose entire psychological framework was built on the desperate need to be brilliant and flawless, the devastating impact of that public humiliation from an intellectual authority figure broke something inside of him. What followed was a profoundly dark and chaotic period in his life. He completely dropped out of the Polytechnic, cut off contact with his family to hide his failure, and suffered total financial ruin. He developed a severe compulsive gambling addiction, spending his days playing billiards for money in shady cafes, and eventually ended up suffering a catastrophic nervous breakdown in Budapest. His sensory perception went completely out of control. His hearing became so acutely hypersensitive that the ticking of a pocket watch 3 rooms away sounded to him like a blacksmith bringing a heavy hammer down on a metal anvil. The vibration of a train passing a mile away caused him excruciating physical pain. He had to have his bed placed on rubber cushions just to tolerate the microscopic vibrations of the building. He was essentially stripped raw, experiencing the world without any neurological filters. Yet, it is often out of these moments of complete psychological shattering that profound breakthroughs occur. While slowly recovering, he was taking a walk through a city park in Budapest with a friend as the sun was setting. Looking at the sky, he began quoting poetry from memory, specifically a very dramatic passage from Goethe's Faust about the setting sun and the spirit moving forward. Right in the middle of reciting this poem, he froze, struck by a sudden violent flash of intuition, an absolute epiphany. He grabbed a stick from the ground and frantically started drawing a diagram in the dirt of the park path, while his friend watched in confusion. What he drew in the dirt that afternoon was the conceptual blueprint for the rotating magnetic field, a simple diagram that fundamentally changed the trajectory of human civilization. It was the holy grail he had been searching for since that humiliating lecture in Graz. He realized that by using 2 or more alternating currents and feeding them into the motor slightly out of phase with each other, he could create a magnetic field that naturally rotated around the inside of the machine. This invisible, rotating magnetic force would grab the inner metal rotor and drag it along with it in a perfect circle. There was no need for commutator brushes, no physical friction, and no sparking. Just smooth, silent, incredibly efficient alternating power. He possessed the answer to revolutionizing global industry, but the problem was that he was a nobody. The European financial establishment was not interested in funding a radical new paradigm. Knowing he needed capital and infrastructure, he set his sights on America. In 1884, He arrived on a boat in New York City. When he stepped off the ship, he had exactly 4 cents in his pocket, alongside a book of his own poetry, a few articles he had written, and some complex mathematical calculations for a theoretical flying machine. With absolutely nothing to his name, he walked straight into the Edison Machine Works, managing to get hired by the most famous inventor on the planet, Thomas Edison. But the collision between the ultimate theoretical architect and the ultimate brute force empiricist was about to spark one of the most ruthless betrayals in the history of capitalism. He did not walk in off the street entirely blind. He arrived bearing a letter of recommendation from Charles Batchelor, who was one of Edison's top managers over in Europe. That letter is legendary in the history of science. It simply read, "I know 2 great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." Now, Thomas Edison was notoriously skeptical of formal education and theoretical physics, but he was also a pragmatist. He desperately needed the help because his direct current generators spread across New York City were incredibly inefficient. They were highly prone to breaking down and required constant, expensive maintenance. This precise vulnerability set the stage for one of the most intimate betrayals in the history of capitalism. Edison sat down with this young, eager Serbian immigrant and made a massive proposition, promising Tesla $50,000 if he could redesign and improve the efficiency of Edison's failing, clunky DC dynamos. To put that in perspective, $50,000 in 1884 is the equivalent of well over $1 million today. It was life-changing, empire-building wealth. Tesla, driven by that immense, obsessive need to work and prove his perfection, accepted the challenge. He pulled agonizing 20-hour workdays, 7 days a week, for months on end. He poured his entire soul into the project and succeeded brilliantly, vastly improving the output and reliability of Edison's machines. And then, he walked into Edison's office and asked for the $50,000 he was promised. Edison's response was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. Leaning back, Edison laughed in his face and said, "Tesla, you don't understand our American humor." He completely refused to pay the bonus, offering instead a minor bump in his weekly salary. It was not merely a refusal of money. It was a total invalidation of Tesla's worth and dignity. It was a devastating, crushing blow, and Tesla, acting on pure principle and absolute disgust, quit immediately and walked out the door. However, standing on your principles in 1880s New York City, when you are a penniless immigrant, does not put food on the table. Because he had no financial backing, no network, and the economy was in a severe slump, this brilliant mind, the man who had already conceptualized the AC motor that would power the 20th century, spent the next winter literally digging ditches. He toiled in the freezing, muddy streets of New York City for $2 a day just to avoid starving to death. He later wrote in his journals that looking back on his grand education and his brilliant mind while his hands were blistering in the frozen mud was the most agonizing, humiliating period of his entire life. To truly understand how this clash happened, one must look at how their 2 minds fundamentally processed reality. They were biologically incompatible in their approach to problem solving. Think of Edison as the ultimate brute force computer hacker, whose entire philosophy was built on trial and error. His famous quote, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration," essentially meant his strategy was to try 1,000 different random materials in a laboratory, like bamboo, cotton, paper, and various metals, just waiting until one of them magically glowed inside a vacuum tube to make a light bulb. It was sweaty, exhausting, blind empiricism. Tesla, on the other hand, was a supreme theoretical architect. He looked at Edison's chaotic, messy laboratory and thought the man was wasting massive amounts of time and energy. Tesla firmly believed that if Edison would just sit down and apply a few simple mathematical equations and mental models before he started building, he could save himself weeks of blind trial and error. Crucially, Edison was a strict practical empiricist and a deeply entrenched businessman who was furiously protecting a massive, established financial monopoly based entirely on direct current infrastructure. He owned the patents, the copper wire manufacturing, and the power plants. Tesla was a formalist, pushing a vastly superior, highly elegant, but deeply commercially threatening alternating current system. Therefore, Edison's arrogant refusal to pay Tesla that bonus was arguably the most catastrophic business error of the 19th century. By throwing Tesla out into the streets, Edison unwittingly birthed, hardened, and unleashed his own greatest rival. Edison's betrayal left Tesla financially desperate, but intellectually unchained. This desperation forced him to seek out George Westinghouse, the one man who had the immense capital, the ruthless business acumen, and the visionary foresight to weaponize his AC patents against Edison's monopoly. Westinghouse was a formidable industrialist who had already amassed a massive fortune by inventing compressed air brakes for the rapidly expanding railroad industry, and he understood infrastructure on a continental scale. When he looked at Tesla's patents for the alternating current motor and generator, he did not see an abstract physics puzzle. He instantly recognized it as the absolute future of human energy, the missing technological link needed to electrify the entire country. Westinghouse saw this as the ultimate weapon because Edison's direct current had a fatal, insurmountable physics flaw. DC could barely travel a single mile from the generating power plant without losing a massive percentage of its energy to heat dissipation in the thick copper wires. If you wanted to run a city on Edison's DC power, you would literally need to build a massive, smoke-belching coal plant on practically every other city block just to keep the lights on in a single neighborhood. It was incredibly expensive and logistically absurd for anything outside of a dense urban center. Westinghouse stepped in and bought Tesla's AC patents for a sum of $60,000, plus a generous royalty agreement on future horsepower generated. He did this because alternating current possessed a superpower that DC lacked: the transformer. With AC, the electricity flows back and forth, creating a changing magnetic field that allows you to run the current through a transformer to step up the voltage to incredibly high levels. In physics, if you increase the voltage, you lower the current for the same amount of power, resulting in vastly less friction and heat loss in the wires. At high voltage, AC power can travel for hundreds and hundreds of miles through very thin, relatively cheap wires with almost zero energy loss. Once it reaches a distant town, another transformer steps it down to a safe, low voltage to power incandescent lamps in a family's living room. Edison's DC, because it does not alternate, cannot use transformers and is stuck at one voltage, making long-distance transmission physically impossible. Edison looked at the mathematics of AC transmission and the massive financial backing of Westinghouse, instantly realizing his entire DC empire was facing total unmitigated annihilation. Obsolete and cornered, he launched one of the most brutal, gruesome, and terrifying corporate propaganda wars in American history: the War of the Currents. If he could not beat AC on efficiency, he would destroy it with pure public terror. He hired a former employee named Harold Brown to travel the country, staging highly publicized, horrific public demonstrations, gathering crowds to publicly electrocute stray dogs, calves, and full-grown horses using alternating current. The goal was to prove to the terrified public that AC was a deadly, uncontrollable menace that would murder your family if you let it into your home. It was a systematic campaign of psychological terror designed to make the average citizen associate the very concept of alternating current with sudden violent death. The depravity of the campaign reached its peak when Edison and Brown colluded with state prison officials in New York, who were actively searching for a more humane method of executing prisoners to replace the gallows. Edison pulled political strings behind the scenes to ensure that the very first electric chair installed at Auburn State Prison was powered by a secretly acquired Westinghouse AC generator. This led to the execution of William Kemmler in 1890, an event the historical sources describe as incredibly graphic and tragically botched. The first jolt didn't kill him, but severely injured him. They had to turn the generator back on and basically cook the man alive. It was an agonizing spectacle that left witnesses physically ill, which was exactly what Edison's camp had hoped for. They wanted the front pages of every newspaper in the country to describe the horrific power of AC, even initiating a massive PR push to get the public and the press to call execution by the electric chair Westinghousing, wanting people to say that a criminal wasn't executed, he was Westinghoused. But reality is always about economics, not a simplistic comic book narrative where Edison is the pure, greedy villain and Tesla is the innocent, victimized scientist. Edison was a desperate, heavily leveraged businessman whose entire financial empire and personal legacy were suddenly thrust into obsolescence by a smarter technology. The war of the currents was never a genuine scientific debate about the dangers of high voltage, as engineers on both sides understood the physics perfectly well. It was primarily a vicious commercial and financial dispute dressed up as a public safety crusade. Edison was losing the economic argument because AC required vastly less copper wiring and far fewer generating plants. Unable to compete on price or scale, he weaponized the public's ignorance of invisible electrical forces through fear. Tesla and Westinghouse did not just sit in a boardroom writing angry letters. Tesla understood showmanship just as well as Edison, deciding to physically counter Edison's fear-mongering in the most dramatic, theatrical way possible. Tesla held massive public lectures, dressing in full evening wear, and standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people to willingly pass 1 million volts of high-frequency electricity directly through his own body. The visual accounts are stunning. He stood there completely calm, with coronal flames shooting from his fingertips, holding glass tubes that glowed brightly in his bare hands, simply from the electrical field radiating around him. Remaining completely unharmed, he proved visually that his alternating currents were perfectly safe when properly engineered. This spellbinding showmanship was anchored in incredibly solid physics, demonstrating a phenomenon known as the skin effect. At extremely high frequencies, alternating current does not penetrate deep into conductive material, but travels rapidly over the outer surface of the skin, completely bypassing the heart and vital organs. Functionally, it was a parlor trick based on advanced physics, but the visual spectacle combined with the undeniable economic superiority of AC won the war. The death blow to Edison's DC empire came when Westinghouse and Tesla submitted a massive bid to light the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Known as the Columbian Exposition, they vastly undercut General Electric. The corporate behemoth formed after Edison's financiers essentially forced him out of his own company due to the AC failure by over $150,000. When President Grover Cleveland pushed the ceremonial button, nearly 100,000 incandescent lamps simultaneously lit up the fairgrounds, creating the White City that dazzled 27 million visitors. They immediately followed this public relations victory by harnessing the colossal, terrifying physical power of the Niagara Falls hydroelectric plant, successfully sending industrial levels of power 26 miles away to run the factories of Buffalo, New York. The war was definitively over. AC won and laid the foundation for the exact electrical grid we still use to power our entire civilization today. But achieving total victory over the global power grid was not enough for the psychology of Nikola Tesla. Having conquered the transmission of power through a solid copper wire, the only logical frontier left for a mind that absolutely refused to be constrained by physical limits was to get rid of the wire entirely. This marked the transition into the 1890s, the era of the showman, the era of robotics, and the era of the Martians. Diving deep into high frequencies, he invented the iconic Tesla coil in 1891, a resonant transformer circuit capable of producing millions of volts. He pioneered early, highly dangerous X-ray technology called shadowgraphs, imaging his own hand right around the exact same time Wilhelm Röntgen was discovering them in Germany. Crucially, he developed the true, undeniable, foundational principles of radio transmission. While textbooks generally credit Guglielmo Marconi with inventing radio, a man who even won a Nobel Prize for his work, the engineering reality is that Marconi relied heavily on 17 of Tesla's prior patents to build his system. The United States Supreme Court eventually stepped in and officially invalidated Marconi's foundational radio patents in 1943, ruling definitively that Tesla's work significantly predated Marconi's. Tesla's mind was moving so fast that he did not stop at transmitting simple, invisible signals through the air. In 1898, he set up a massive indoor tank of water at an exhibition in Madison Square Garden and debuted the teleautomaton. It was a sleek, iron-hulled boat, floating freely in the pool without any wires or ropes. Using a remote control box held in his hand, he drove the boat around the pool, making it the world's first public demonstration of a radio-controlled vehicle. In an era of heavy steam engines and horse-drawn carriages, the very concept of remote control did not exist outside of fairy tales. When the boat responded instantly to his silent commands, turning left, turning right, stopping, and flashing its onboard lights, the crowd was plunged into a state of mesmerized terror. People standing in bowler hats and corsets literally thought it was black magic or telepathy. Cynical reporters actually suggested he had somehow trained a tiny monkey and hidden it inside the hull of the boat to steer it, as the leap in technology was so profound that the public mind fractured trying to explain it. But Tesla saw this as the literal dawn of robotics, understanding that if a machine could receive commands remotely, it could eventually act autonomously. He proposed a fleet of remote-controlled torpedoes to the U.S. military to destroy enemy ships without risking sailors' lives. But the Navy brass lacked the visionary capacity to grasp the concept and completely passed on it. Frustrated by the lack of vision in New York, Tesla packed up a massive amount of equipment and moved out west to Colorado Springs in 1899 to push the boundaries of physics even further. What he built in that isolated terrain would violently shatter the boundary between pure science and profound madness. Colorado Springs was carefully chosen because it provided the extremely high altitude and the incredibly dry, electrically charged air he needed to conduct experiments on a scale that would have been far too dangerous in Manhattan. He built a sprawling, barn-like laboratory dominating the landscape, featuring a massive wooden tower topped with a copper mast reaching 80 feet into the sky. Inside, he constructed a 52-foot magnifying transmitter, essentially a monstrously overpowered, heavily modified Tesla coil. The experiments he ran in that wooden barn were almost apocalyptic in their sheer scale and auditory violence. He produced 135-foot artificial lightning bolts that arched out of the roof. The thunder generated from his lab was so deafening, it could be heard clearly by people walking 15 miles away. The ambient electrical field he generated was so intense that locals reported horses experiencing electrical shocks through their metal horseshoes, just walking down the dirt roads. Butterflies were supposedly flying around the fields at night, with glowing halos of St. Elmo's fire illuminating their wings. And amidst all this chaos, he successfully proved his theory. He lit 200 incandescent lamps, totally without wires, planted in the ground 26 miles away from the lab. But this profound success is exactly where the narrative starts to violently veer away from rigorous science and into the sensational pulp fiction archetype. While sitting alone in his lab late at night, listening to the highly sensitive receivers on his equipment, he claimed to have intercepted a series of rhythmic, pulsing, highly organized numerical signals. He went straight to the national press and announced that he believed he was receiving direct mathematical communications from intelligent beings on the planet Mars. Did a man who practically invented modern physics actually believe he was talking to little green men? Most modern astrophysicists and radio engineers agree that what Tesla actually intercepted were either natural, low-frequency radio waves generated by massive, distant atmospheric thunderstorms, or perhaps he was inadvertently picking up the faint, rhythmic pulses of the very early wireless telegraphy experiments being conducted by Marconi far across the ocean. His receiving equipment was so unprecedentedly sensitive, and the entire field of radio astronomy was so completely unknown that his brilliant mind, desperate to find patterns in the universe, interpreted natural, cosmic, or terrestrial phenomena as intentional, intelligent design. But nuance does not sell newspapers. The headlines blared, "Tesla talks to Mars." This moment really marks the definitive turning point in his public image. He rapidly transitioned in the eyes of the public from this highly respected, deeply serious, wealthy engineer who crushed Thomas Edison into the wild-haired, sensationalized archetype of the dangerous mad scientist. The line between a visionary prophet and an unhinged eccentric began to blur heavily in the public consciousness, and people began to view him with suspicion rather than reverence. Yet, the tragedy is that his grandest, most ambitious, and ultimately most destructive vision was still yet to come. He wasn't satisfied with merely lighting a few lamps 26 miles away. He formulated a plan to literally turn the entire planet Earth into a giant, vibrating electrical battery. It was a utopian dream that would ultimately break him financially, professionally, and psychologically. We have arrived at the monumental tragedy of Wardenclyffe. Tesla packed up his data from Colorado Springs, headed back to New York, and managed to secure a meeting with the absolute titan of Wall Street, the incredibly powerful financier, J.P. Morgan. Tesla pitched him, and Morgan agreed to invest $150,000, again, millions in today's purchasing power. Tesla took this fortune, bought land in Shoreham, Long Island, and began constructing the Wardenclyffe Tower. This wasn't just a building. It was an architectural monolith. It was a massive, wooden, mushroom-shaped structure, rising 187 feet into the air, crowned with a 55-ton steel hemispherical dome. Beneath the tower, he drove massive iron pipes and routes 300 feet deep into the earth to grip the planet itself. And this massive construction project is where a fatal miscommunication, or perhaps an intentional desperate deception by Tesla, occurred. J.P. Morgan, being a ruthless capitalist, believed he was funding a highly lucrative transatlantic wireless communication system. Morgan wanted to beat the expensive, slow undersea telegraph cables. His goal was to transmit stock quotes, maritime news, and private telegraphs across the ocean instantly, allowing him to completely corner the global financial markets with an invisible monopoly on information. But Tesla had a hidden, almost messianic ultimate goal. He didn't just want to send dots and dashes of Morse code for bankers. His actual plan was to pump millions of volts of electricity deep into the earth, vibrate the entire planet at its natural resonant frequency, and transmit unlimited wireless electrical power to the entire globe. He envisioned a utopian world where anyone, anywhere on Earth, a farmer in the Australian outback or a sailor in the middle of the Pacific, could simply stick a specially tuned metal rod into the ground or hold an antenna in the air and draw down enough electricity to run their home, their factory, or their ship. It was a breathtaking, beautiful, utopian vision of global equality through engineering. However, the brutal, unyielding reality of Gilded Age capitalism quickly caught up with him. While Tesla was still pouring concrete and slowly building his incredibly expensive, complex, massive tower, his old rival Marconi successfully transmitted a cheap, incredibly simple Morse code signal, the letter S, straight across the Atlantic Ocean using basic, inexpensive radio equipment. Marconi achieved Morgan's exact goal for a fraction of what Tesla was spending. Tesla, realizing he was losing the race for communication, became desperate and finally confessed his true goal to Morgan. He admitted he wasn't just building a radio tower, he was building a global power transmitter. When J.P. Morgan realized that Tesla's true goal was broadcasting power to the entire globe that anyone could tap into, the financier completely pulled the funding and cut him off entirely. The underlying economic philosophy was brutally simple. In the Gilded Age, metered economy, you cannot put a physical meter on free energy. If a farmer in Ohio can pull power out of the air using a metal rod, how does J.P. Morgan, sitting in a bank on Wall Street, charge him for it? Capitalism requires scarcity and a mechanism for billing. Without Morgan's backing, the entire project stalled violently, and other investors refused to touch it once Morgan walked away. The financial panic of 1907 further dried up any potential capital in the markets. Tesla fell into massive crushing debt, particularly to the incredibly luxurious Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where he had been living on credit for years, dining like a king while building his tower. Finally, in 1917, the creditors came for him. The magnificent Wardenclyffe Tower was literally rigged with dynamite, blown to the ground, and sold for scrap metal, simply to pay off a mundane $20,000 hotel bill. What does the fall of Wardenclyffe actually mean for the modern persistent myth of free energy? Today, you will see endless passionate internet conspiracies claiming that the global elites, specifically men like J.P. Morgan, crushed Nikola Tesla to stop humanity from having access to free, limitless power. The narrative claims Tesla had invented a magic machine that pulled infinite energy out of the ether, and the capitalists destroyed it to keep us enslaved to oil and coal. But there is a massive fatal physics flaw in that conspiracy theory. We have to synthesize the cold financial realities with the uncompromising scientific ones to debunk this incredibly pervasive myth. The basic laws of thermodynamics state that energy conversion always has a cost. J.P. Morgan pulled out because of capitalism. No meter, no profit. That part of the historical narrative is absolutely true. Morgan killed the project to protect his investments, but the idea that Tesla was somehow magically creating new energy out of thin air, defying the laws of physics, is entirely false. If you look at the architectural blueprints of the Wardenclyffe facility, what sat right next to the giant tower? A massive, conventional, highly expensive, coal-fired generating plant. He was shoveling tons of physical coal into a furnace to create the electricity. His brilliant innovation wasn't creating free energy. He was simply attempting to transmit that conventionally generated energy without using copper wires. From an engineering standpoint, transmitting raw power omnidirectionally through the Earth's crust or the atmosphere is incredibly, hopelessly inefficient. The vast majority of that coal-generated energy would be lost to the environment as heat long before it ever reached a receiver on the other side of the planet. So the energy wasn't free in the sense of defying thermodynamics or creating perpetual motion. It was just a radically unmetered distribution system that still required massive, expensive fuel inputs at the source. The physical destruction of the Wardenclyffe Tower wasn't just a financial ruin for Tesla. It triggered a profound, irreversible psychological collapse. The dynamiting of that tower revealed a terrifying internal battle that Tesla had actually been fighting his entire life, largely in secret, behind the polished facade of the brilliant inventor. As Tesla aged, and as the stress of his failures mounted, a severely debilitating and completely untreated condition began to aggressively take over every aspect of his daily life. His severe, deeply ingrained, and completely untreated obsessive-compulsive disorder began to aggressively take over every aspect of his daily life. He became entirely, helplessly obsessed with the number 3 and its mathematical multiples. He could not simply walk into a building. He had to walk around the entire city block exactly 3 times before approaching the door. If he stayed in a hotel, he demanded that the room number be perfectly divisible by 3. If he went for his daily swim, he had to swim exactly 33 laps. If he lost count at lap 30, he could not just guess or stop. The compulsion forced him to start all over again from zero. His dining rituals were equally rigid and socially alienating. When he sat down for a meal, he required exactly 18 clean linen napkins, a multiple of 3. He would spend an agonizing amount of time meticulously polishing every single piece of his silver cutlery before he could take a bite. He also suffered from extreme misophonia, a debilitating neurological hypersensitivity to specific sounds. The sound of a fly landing on a wooden table in the next room would cause a dull, painful thud in his eardrum. The sound of a carriage in the street felt like an earthquake. He developed a profound, isolating germophobia, absolutely refusing to shake hands with anyone, ever. He claimed the mere sight of a peach gave him a fever, and touching someone else's hair, or even looking too closely at a pearl necklace, caused him intense physical revulsion. Because of these escalating compulsions, he found human interaction incredibly painful. He lived a completely celibate, profoundly solitary life, moving from one hotel to another, eventually landing at the New Yorker Hotel on the 33rd floor in rooms 3, 327, and 3328. The tragic irony is that the man who invented the AC motor was surviving entirely on a meager $125 a month, pity stipend paid out by the Westinghouse Corporation, simply because they did not want the terrible PR nightmare of their foundational inventor freezing and starving to death in the streets of New York. In this extreme, tragic isolation, his only real tangible companions became the feral city pigeons. He would walk to Bryant Park every single day without fail to feed them. He brought sick or injured pigeons back to his hotel room, turning his living space into a makeshift avian hospital to nurse them back to health. He famously claimed in a deeply uncomfortable interview with the press that he had fallen deeply in love with a specific pure white pigeon with gray tips on her wings. He explicitly stated that he loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and that as long as he had her to care for, there was a specific purpose to his life. When she was injured, he spent thousands of dollars. He simply did not have to hire mechanics to build a custom, comfortable, supportive device to hold her body in place while her broken wing and leg healed. Modern, psychological analysis of his life points out something deeply profound about how society treats historical figures. History loves to romanticize Tesla's visions and the sudden flashes of light in his eyes as a magical, mystical superpower given to a chosen genius. However, these were actually terrifying, unmanageable, intrusive OCD thoughts. When he involuntarily pictured a motor breaking down in his head, or when he was blinded by a flash of light in his mind's eye, it was not a magical gift. It was an obsessive compulsion, a neurological misfiring that he could not turn off, no matter how exhausted he was. By romanticizing his mental illness as some kind of wizard's magic, we actually rob him of his immense human resilience. The fact that Nikola Tesla managed to invent the AC power grid, lay the foundational physics of radio, and conceptualize remote control robotics while battling severe, unmedicated, and relentless mental illness every minute of his waking life makes his actual documented accomplishments infinitely more impressive than any science fiction myth. He was fighting a biological war against his own brain chemistry while simultaneously fighting massive corporate wars against ruthless titans like Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan. But his complete lack of business acumen, his inability to compromise, combined with his total retreat from human intimacy, left him incredibly vulnerable in his final decades. Entering the 1930s, as the world watched the rise of fascism in Europe and the drumbeat of global war grew louder, Nikola Tesla called a press conference and made a terrifying public announcement. He announced the invention of a technology he called Teleforce, which the sensationalist press immediately dubbed the death ray. He described it in highly specific technical terms as a defensive particle beam weapon that operated in a vacuum chamber, accelerating microscopic metal ions to a velocity of 270,000 miles per hour. He claimed it could project an invisible, concentrated beam capable of dropping a fleet of 10,000 enemy airplanes from 250 miles away by instantly melting their engine blocks in midair. He pitched it to the public as the ultimate pacifist weapon, genuinely believing that if every nation had a death ray, it would create an impenetrable, invisible wall of force around a country's borders that would make physical invasion impossible, thereby ending all warfare forever. He actively drafted proposals and offered the conceptual blueprints to the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, his native Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. The historical records show that the Soviets actually took him seriously enough to pay him $25,000 for his preliminary research papers on the subject. This is exactly why, when Tesla finally died in his sleep in the New Yorker hotel on January 7th, 1943, the United States military and intelligence apparatus completely panicked. It was the height of World War II, and American soldiers were dying across the globe. The idea that theoretical blueprints for a superweapon might be sitting unsecured in a hotel room safe, highly vulnerable to Nazi spies or Soviet operatives, triggered an immediate, aggressive, extra-legal response. Literally, the morning after the maid found his body, before the public even fully absorbed the news, agents from the FBI and the Office of Alien Property Custodians swooped into the hotel. They broke into his safe and confiscated roughly 80 massive steamer trunks filled with his life's research, private notebooks, and physical prototypes. Tesla was a fully naturalized United States citizen, meaning the Office of Alien Property Custodian had absolutely zero legal jurisdiction to seize his property. Yet, they used the blanket, unquestionable excuse of wartime national security to confiscate his entire life's work. To figure out exactly what they had, the government brought in a highly respected academic, Dr. John G. Trump, an MIT physicist and electrical engineer who was indeed the uncle of Donald Trump. Dr. Trump was tasked with spending 3 days locked in a room systematically evaluating the contents of the 80 trunks. His official, classified conclusion to the military was that Tesla's later work was entirely speculative, philosophical, and promotional. Trump explicitly stated there were no workable blueprints, no hidden physics that the military didn't already understand, and no actual weapon. He concluded it was just the grandiose, sad dreams of an aging, unwell man trying to stay relevant. But this is where the narrative gets incredibly murky. If Dr. Trump explicitly said it was all useless speculation, then why did the US military secretly launch an initiative called Project Nick at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base specifically to test his particle beam concepts? They were publicly calling him a crazy old man to the press, while secretly funneling military funding into trying to build his death ray. Even crazier, when Tesla's estate was finally released by the government years later and shipped to his nephew in Belgrade in 1952, only 60 of the original 80 trunks arrived. 20 trunks of his life's work simply vanished into the ether while in federal custody. Whether those missing 20 trunks contain mundane hotel receipts and old laundry bills, or highly classified military research on directed energy weapons, we may truly never know. We absolutely must use this moment to address and violently debunk the absurd internet myths that have attached themselves to that mystery. First and foremost, Nikola Tesla did not invent a self-recharging electric car that ran on cosmic rays. That concept fundamentally violates the laws of thermodynamics, and the story originated years after his death from a known fraud claiming to be a distant relative. Second, he did not invent the modern computer. He patented a very simple mechanical relay and gate for his remote control boat, which is basic logic circuitry, whereas scientists like Alan Turing and John von Neumann built the true foundation of computing. Third, he was not a time traveler, nor did he receive technology from the future. Fourth, he had absolutely zero connection to pyramid power or ancient Egyptian energy grids. Finally, that famous mystical quote, "If you only knew the magnificence of the 3, 6, and 9, then you would have a key to the universe," is completely fabricated. There is zero historical record of him ever saying or writing that. It is modern internet lore, lazily superimposed over his very real, very painful OCD symptoms regarding the number 3. Why does our culture feel the need to invent these wild science fiction fantasies when his actual documented reality is already so overwhelmingly incredible? The idea of Nikola Tesla has become culturally more powerful than the man himself. He represents the ultimate tragic archetype of the pure, brilliant scientist who is maliciously crushed by greedy capitalists. Deep down, society desperately wants to believe there is a secret to free energy that could instantly solve climate change and free us from paying monthly utility bills. Those missing 20 trunks symbolize our collective, desperate hope that limitless, world-saving technology is real, but just unfairly hidden from us. Psychologically, it is far easier to believe that an evil government stole his magic boxes than to accept the mundane, depressing reality that a brilliant, singular mind simply grew old, succumbed to severe mental illness, and failed to achieve his final, impossible dream. I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. Look around you right now. Think about the physical device you're using to listen to this. The alternating current silently powering your home. The Wi-Fi or cellular radio, waves invisibly transmitting massive amounts of data through the air. And the complex, brushless induction motors spinning inside your refrigerator or electric vehicle. Every single one of those foundational technologies traces its direct lineage back to the mind of a man who died penniless, emotionally broken and alone, feeding birds in a hotel room, because the financial world could not figure out how to put a meter on his grandest ideas. It raises a haunting question. How many modern-day Teslas are currently slipping through the cracks, dismissed as eccentric dreamers simply because their brilliant ideas cannot be easily packaged and sold? If you loved this journey through the brilliant, turbulent mind of the man who essentially invented the architecture of the 20th century. Make sure you hit the like button, share this video with a fellow history nerd, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. We have plenty more incredible, multi-dimensional stories of history's greatest, most controversial minds coming your way. Drop a comment below. Do you think the government is still hiding the secrets of the death ray in those missing 20 trunks? Or was Dr. Trump right that it was all just the philosophical dreams of an aging genius? Let us know, and we will see you in the next one.